Hello all. Because you asked, I'm going to go through the assignment sheet for task number 1 and talk a little bit more about what it is I'm expecting from this particular paper and how this paper is designed to really get at all of the rhetorical learning that you did in this particular module over the past 2 weeks. So just to give you an idea, I pulled this from the assignment sheet that's in task 1 in the module 1 folder. So what you're dealing with in this is creating a myth and a narrative, and what we're specifically dealing with is a combination of chapter 2 and then the chapter on Aristotle and the chapter on Roman rhetoric. How do myth and narrative function rhetorically, and how do the ideas about rhetoric from Aristotle and from the Roman rhetoric, where rhetoric is a way of thinking to make knowledge, how do those tie back to the idea of myth and narrative functioning rhetorically, and then how can you write about that whole situation? So your goal is to weave, as it says, a collection of facts that you required in this module. So we're focusing specifically on the rhetoric. Use the additional articles as well. So what are disciplinary discourses? What does it mean to write for a specific discipline? Because myth and narratives function that way. We write narratives across the board, across genre, across disciplines, but we write them in very specific ways for each of those. So how does that function overall? And then how does that create a disciplinary discourse? And how do we write and create and invent the university or invent the writing situation in that particular case through narrative? That's the goal. So that's focusing specifically on obviously Bazell and Bartholomew, as well as everything from week 2. So you're going to select an audience. You're going to provide cohesive pericopes for your narrative, include intertextual allusion, ensure character credibility, apply effective narrative technique, and practice cyclical storytelling. So to really be clear on who your audience is, you're going to want a really clear introduction on this particular paper, where it's a much more academic focused argument as opposed to the rest of the narrative, which will be much more story-based. Then with all of the rest of these, what you're going to want to do is weave story into it. When you get to the intertextual allusions, the references that are tying your narrative back to outside sources, this is where the rhetorical theory is going to come in. So we look to Aristotelian texts, and we look to Cicero texts, and we look to Quintilian texts as very, very baseline. These are the people that you need to know to understand ancient Greek and ancient Roman rhetoric. They're foundational texts for that particular piece, which means similar to the way that Smith used the pericope discussion in chapter 2 to pick apart the Bible, you can use the Aristotelian theory and the Roman theory as your intertextual allusion and your intertextual references. So you can weave in bits of theory that way so that you have the sources cited, so that you're bringing in those particular outside voices and you're getting the citations that you need, while also lending credibility to your particular story to make your story more powerful. If we look at the way that Oedipus Rex and Odysseus are told, yes, they were oral stories, and so a lot of the textual clues that are left throughout those particular pieces have more to do with how do we remember the story, and how does somebody who's singing and telling that particular story tell an epic story, so how do we put memory devices in there? But the other thing is we have a lot of intertextual devices, so that parts of the beginning of the story refer to parts at the end of the story, so that it's very cohesive, so that it makes sense, so that we understand how that entire world works. So we watched Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure last night, and we had a lot of question because intertextual allusions were escaping us. So how do these kinds of things happen? How do we make sense of this? So our big one for Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure is they had to give an oral history final exam. Everybody gave it by themselves except for Bill and Ted, which was obviously highly problematic. And what were all of those high school students doing standing in the auditorium to actually listen to all of these for an entire day? Why wasn't everybody at school? Why did Bill and Ted have to do all of their chores before they could go to school? Like, there were so many intertextual moments that made things funny and that allowed them to show all of the historical figures. Here's what San Dimas looks like. San Dimas high school football rules. But what they didn't do is make sense to your average viewer who's completed high school, to your average viewer who's possibly teaching high school right now. Like, those kinds of references don't make sense. The other one that we watched with our son is Home Alone. So in today's time, Home Alone makes even less sense than it did as I was a kid. Like, the police just go and knock on the door and they're like, oh, nobody's there, whatever, we're just going to walk away, this 8-year-old's going to be fine, and then the parents walk off the plane and they go home and yay, happy family reunion. Okay, in today's time, CPS would have arrested those parents as soon as they walked off the airplane. Like, that's the kind of culture we live in. So intertextual allusions, we're having a lot of difficulty finding the credibility in those particular sources. So that's something that you want to think about as you're weaving your particular story. How can you refer to some of these texts that we've read as baseline mandatory knowledge texts for your story so that they lend credibility to your story to your particular audience without them overwhelming? So what you really want to look at is, how do you build credibility? How do you build credibility for your particular audiences, and how does all of this come together? So what you want to consider for narrative, and these are possible stories, these are not the only ones that you can possibly use, are student or employee myths about effective writing and about effective communication. So a lot of students don't think that they need to read their work. One of the skills or the revision practices that I often tell students to use or to employ is to read your work out loud before you submit it, even in email form, especially when you're sending emails. If you don't read it out loud, you don't know what you're missing, and you kind of have to walk away and come back to it. I had a supervisor while I was working through my graduate study, and she would leave out verbs, kind of the cornerstone of any good sentence when you're communicating to an employee. Like, I need you to do this. It was more, I work. And I'm like, congratulations. Like, it didn't make any sense because very huge portions of the sentence were missing because she didn't think to read her sentence out loud. So what kinds of myths can you tie to that? What are the student expectations? Obviously, as composition instructors and writing instructors, the big one is, I'm never going to need to write. This class is pointless. I'm a biology major. I don't need to write, completely forgetting the lab notebooks that they have to turn in every single semester, if not multiple times during the semester, and all of the writing that goes along with that, all of the documentation that goes along with that. If we look at a lot of especially the notebooks that were kept by somebody like Charles Darwin, extensive amounts of writing in addition to the images that modern biology students are somewhat disconnected from. So that would be a myth that you could deal with. Teacher or employer myths, those types of things. The use of rhetorical principles in educational or professional settings to continue a specific myth. So how is it, and ethos is always the big one when we talk about ethos and credibility, how is it that ethos is commonly understood, and in what ways are the small portions of composition courses or the small portions of education that employees are remembering, how is that lending the idea to a misunderstanding of ethos? So for a lot of people, ethos, when we say credibility, is just going to be, what's your background? What is your experience? So if we look at the current debates that are going on for a presidential election, what's your background? How long have you been in politics? What are your beliefs? What people are completely ignoring, even though Hillary Clinton is constantly criticized for this, what do you look like? How do you present yourself? When we look at Obama and he's giving a speech, he has a very presidential way of speaking. He has a really solid way of making a point, of addressing the audience, of addressing the camera. That all lends itself to credibility, to ethos, but none of it is considered as arguing, as a form of argument. So we have this myth circulating that all we need is background knowledge. So we're ignoring, in this particular case, a lot of what Isocrates, the sophist, had to say about being naturally a good speaker, training a good speaker to be an even better, more credible speaker, and then all of the other aspects of credibility that play into how we perceive people. I think I said this in my other video, but there is this kind of anthropological fact that floats out there a lot of times. If we look at most politicians are male, most of them are white, and very few of them have facial hair. So when you ask voters, especially likely voters, are you going to vote for, person, let's say white male A with a mustache or white male B with no facial hair, most people say we're going to vote for B because we trust him more. And that's their response. They don't trust people, or males specifically, with facial hair. And what anthropology has to say is, if you look at the number of people or the kinds of people getting married, it's much more likely for a man getting married to have facial hair, because facial hair is a sign of virility. So we have very competing biological interests influencing how we perceive these particular situations and what our needs are. These aren't things that we commonly think about. I mean, this is something that anthropology talks about, but it never really gets out of there. So we have this this myth that facial hair means that we can't trust that particular person. So, especially in this culture where beards are very popular, if you tell somebody with a beard that, they're like, well, I'm trustworthy. And it's like, but you're not a politician. You're not understanding those particular connections. You're not understanding how ethos functions for what a politician's attempting to accomplish versus what you're accomplishing in your everyday life. So these are the myths that kind of circulate. Yes, that one's super complex compared to some of the easier ones, but it just shows you how vast this topic can be, and you can essentially talk about whatever you want. Make sure that you include for your intertextual references at least 3 chapters from Smith. So obviously I've already highlighted myth and narrative as one of the highlighting chapters. I've talked about the sophist, especially Isocrates, with his how do we train somebody to do this. Aristotle and Cicero are going to be really foundational. You can talk about Aristotle and Quintilian depending on the version of rhetoric that you're specifically going to talk about. Aristotle and the Rhetorica ad Herennium are also good combinations of rhetorical background theory. You just really, really, really need to make sure when you're talking about rhetorical theory that you don't talk about it even through your myth, that we can use rhetoric to get inside the head of the speaker. So I can watch a Bernie Sanders speech, I can watch a Donald Trump speech, I can watch a Hillary Clinton speech, and I can talk about the way that ethos, pathos, logos, and kairos function to make knowledge. I cannot use those as critiques. Even the Cicero and Quintilian and Rhetorica versions of those key principles are not designed as critique. They're designed as how are we making knowledge and how does all of that knowledge function. You'll want to include at least 4 additional readings for Module 1. We talked about Aesop's Fables overall as a format. That would be a really good way. So you've got a introduction, and then you've got story, and then you have big moral conclusion. And I'm being very broad with my use of morals here, so make sure that you consider that. You don't have to write a moral tale as much as a moral tale. And by morals, I mean, how do we all get along? And a lot of that goes beyond the traditional religious tie that we see to the term moral. So Aesop's Fables, Eastern versus Western, or Eastern and Western rhetoric, and how both of those can lend intertextual references. Bazel is a really great way to talk about disciplinary discourses. Bartholomew with how do we invent these particular situations. So if you're dealing more with a student or an employee, you can definitely use Bartholomew as a great intertextual reference for how is it that you're expected to invent this particular situation so that you can talk about this. Your narrative should include the following parts: obviously introduction, body, conclusion. Put all of your references in MLA or AP format at the end. And overall, you should have 3 to 5 pages typed double spaced. Please don't play with the margins. I do actually notice. Pick a font that's readable, but beyond that, I don't care. It doesn't have to be Times New Roman. And then make sure that you include a cover letter. So this cover letter serves 2 purposes. One, when you go through these questions, what I'm really asking is, did you include all of these pieces in your paper so that I can give you the A that you feel you deserve? And then 2, you can really talk through where is it that you saw the struggle so that when I address your particular submission and I leave comments for you, they can be the most helpful to you. So here, I can put a random comment and say, here's where I see a little bit of struggle. Maybe you didn't notice this. Here's what you can do. But if you felt like you were struggling in a specific spot, I can say, oh, I can see this. I can see where you got to this. Let's do this. And then, you're going to understand this a little bit better. So make sure that you deal with this cover letter as well, because it's going to be really important for how you understand this overall task. Overall format, there's a specific one here. It doesn't matter so much because it's going to be uploaded to BBLearn. What you do really need to do, especially if you use a Mac, is BBLearn and Mac do not get along. So you need to upload your document in .doc, .docx, or .rtf. You can do PDF if you absolutely want to. The bad side of PDF is I can't leave in-text comments in BBLearn. So what I will do for you guys is I will leave an overall note in the grading comments, and then I will leave comments throughout your text when you upload the assignment. So make sure you use one of these 3 formats so that I actually have access to do that. If you upload it in PDF, BBLearn won't let me access the PDF so that I can embed comments. So if you guys have any further questions, feel free to send me a direct message tweet or to just add me on your question in Twitter, and I'll be sure to address it. I did address other questions that people had posted, so there are also answers there. Otherwise, good luck.